Fellow members of the South Carolina House of Representatives, I rise today not simply as a legislator, but as someone shaped by the history of this state and by the sacrifices of those who fought to make our democracy more inclusive and more just. I stand before you today to urge this body not to redraw South Carolina's congressional district lines. Our congressional districts have already passed muster as constitutional. So why now? This proposed map would weaken or eliminate the ability of African Americans to elect a congressional representative of their choice. For generations, the right to vote has been called the cornerstone of American democracy. But the true test of democracy is not simply whether citizens can cast a ballot. The true test is whether those votes truly matter. The United States Supreme Court ruling in Louisiana versus Calais has sent shockwaves throughout the South. And in response, legislatures across South Carolina states immediately began efforts to redraw congressional maps. Here in South Carolina, this House quickly passed legislation to redraw the congressional district lines. But I ask you today, what message are we sending if we use this moment not to strengthen democracy, but to weaken representation for communities that have fought for generations simply to have their voices heard? For many, redistricting may seem like a political strategy, but African Americans in South Carolina, it is deeply personal. It is about whether the progress secured during the civil rights movement will endure or slowly be dismantled. I come from a household where education and community service were not optional, they were expected. My parents were educators, but equally important, they were community leaders committed to civic engagement and justice. As a little girl, I remember meetings taking place in our home late into the evening. I remember neighbors gathered around our kitchen table discussing equity, fairness, and opportunity. Sometimes I accompanied my mother and father to meetings in the homes of others. Those gatherings were not social occasions. They were meetings about survival, dignity, and civil rights. You see, I grew up in a segregated South Carolina where schools, churches, restaurants, and stores were separated by race. African Americans were denied opportunities, denied equal treatment, and denied political representation. My parents and others organized marches, sit-ins, protests, and boycotts because they believed that this country could become better than it was. They faced resistance, they faced intimidation, but they continued because they believed future generations deserved a voice. And slowly, through litigation, courageous activism, and congressional action, this nation began to change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public accommodations and employment discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited discriminatory voting practices that had systemically disenfranchised African Americans across the South. The Fair Housing Act prohibited racial discrimination in housing. These laws opened doors that had long been closed. And in South Carolina, African Americans gained greater access to the ballot box. Black voter registration increased dramatically. More African Americans were elected to local governments, school boards, county councils, the General Assembly, and Congress. Representation mattered because representation meant communities that had long been ignored finally had advocates at the table. It meant fighting for educational equity. It meant addressing healthcare disparities. It meant advocating for infrastructure improvements and economic investment in underserved communities. It meant ensuring that African American voices were included in decisions affecting South Carolina's future. And one of the clearest examples of that progress has been in the existence of a congressional district where African American voters have had a meaningful opportunity to elect a representative who understands their lived experiences and concerns of their communities. Today, that progress is under threat. South Carolina is now considering congressional maps that could effectively eliminate the only district represented by an African American congressman. As a sitting legislator, I asked my colleagues to think carefully about what this would mean for our constituents. When congressional district lines are redrawn to dilute African American voting strength, the consequences do not end with politics. The consequences will affect real people across our state. It will affect whether underserved communities receive fair access to federal resources and economic investment. It will affect whether rural hospitals, healthcare clinics, and maternal health services receive strong advocacy in Washington. It would affect educational opportunities for our children, including support for public education, workforce development, and historically Black colleges and universities. It will affect infrastructure improvements in communities that have been historically overlooked. It will affect whether small businesses in minority communities have access to economic opportunities and federal support programs. And perhaps more importantly, it will affect whether our constituents continue to believe that their voices matter in our democracy. If we redraw these lines in a way that make it nearly impossible for African Americans to elect a congressional representative of their choice, we risk diluting decades of progress achieved through sacrifice and struggle. We risk discouraging voter participation. We risk diminishing advocacy for communities already facing disparities in healthcare, education, housing, and economic opportunity. And we risk sending a dangerous message that the gains of the civil rights movement can be reversed through the redrawing of maps. Colleagues, representation is not symbolic alone. Representation determines who is present when decisions are made about federal funding, transportation, healthcare, education, environmental protections, and economic development. Representation determines whose concerns are heard and whose communities are prioritized. And some will argue that race should no longer be considered in redistricting, but history teaches us otherwise. We cannot ignore the realities that led Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act in the first place. The Voting Rights Act was enacted because minority communities were systematically excluded from meaningful political participation. And while we have made progress, disparities still exist. The answer is not to diminish representation. The answer is to ensure fairness and equal opportunity within our democratic process. Our parents and grandparents did not endure marches, jail cells, police intimidation, and violence so that future generations could once again face barriers to representation. Their struggle was about creating a democracy where every citizen has a fair opportunity to participate and to be heard. Today, we have a responsibility to protect that legacy. As legislators, we are entrusted with safeguarding the constitutional rights of all South Carolinians, not manipulating district lines in ways that weaken communities or silence voices. I urge this body to reject efforts that would dilute African American voting strength and diminish fair representation in Congress. So let us choose fairness over division. Let us choose inclusion over exclusion. Let us demonstrate that South Carolina can move forward without turning back the clock on progress that so many fought to achieve. And as I reflect on those meetings in my childhood home, I now understand what my parents knew all along. Democracy only survives when people are willing to protect it. And so that today, that responsibility belongs to us. And I ask you, my fellow legislators, to stand on the side of fairness, representation, and democracy. Do not redraw these lines in ways that silence communities who have fought too long and too hard simply to have their voices heard. Thank you.